what I want to talk about is the what's called the old quest of the historical Jesus. Now, to make sense of something called the old quest, we need to put it in the context of a number of ways in which the historical Jesus has been looked for. So the old quest is usually regarded as having happened between about the 1770s and the time of the First World War. There was then ostensibly a period when there was no quest, as if no historians or theologians bothered looking for Jesus historically. That went through to about 1953, when a so-called new quest was begun. That lasted till about the 1970s or 80s, and scholars now talk about there being a third quest of the historical Jesus. In one sense, we can just see this as a quest that has lasted for over 200 years. But what I'm going to talk about now specifically is the old quest, which began in 1778. The old quest of the historical Jesus can be said to begin in 1778, when a text was published by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, which was actually written in the 1760s by Hermann Samuel Reimarus, and it was one of 7 fragments about the origins of early Christianity, and it was the 7th fragment called On the Intention of Jesus and His Disciples. And it was a work that began to question whether the Gospels' recording of Jesus' life was actually accurate. What Reimarus essentially did was claim that the disciples fabricated many of the stories in the Gospels, and therefore he opened up the possibility that the Gospels were deceitful texts and didn't record what actually happened historically. What he was doing was reading the Gospels through rationalist eyes, assuming and claiming that there was no basis for the supernatural accounts that were contained in the Gospels, and so he was challenging orthodoxy in a very rigorous way. It's not surprising that the writings couldn't be published in his own lifetime, which is why Lessing published them posthumously and anonymously in the 1770s. But we could say that that's the start of the modern historical quest for Jesus. In a sense, the next main stopping point in the historical quest could be regarded as 1835, when David Friedrich Strauss published The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. It came out in German in 1835 and 1836, and then in English translation in 1846. And as is often widely known, George Eliot, the English novelist, was involved in the translation of that work into English. Strauss's work is a mammoth 800-page volume, even in English, with a very small print, and he bases his analysis of the Gospels and his study of the life of Jesus on minute attention to the detail of the individual Gospel stories. So that's why he needed go to such great length to present his case. And his main argument was that the rationalists were wrong in trying to somehow cut through the theology of the Gospels and explain the theology away, and the supernaturalists were equally wrong to try and claim everything that's there in the Gospels as actually having happened. So he was arguing for a different kind of approach, which acknowledged what he called the mythological element of the Gospels. So many of the stories that were presented as narrative and received often as straightforward history in the Gospels are in fact myths. So in other words, he was trying to find out what kind of writing the Gospels are, which didn't disregard the historical data that is somehow within the texts, but nevertheless accepted they're a different kind of writing and have a different purpose than simply to present us with historical data. This was a major challenge, of course, to orthodoxy in a different way than had been the case with Reimarus, because Strauss still wanted to claim that he was doing theology and respecting the theological content and purpose of the Gospels. But of course, for Orthodox Christian believers to be told the Gospels were myth was problematic, because they weren't often very understanding what even Strauss was meaning by myth, and that just sounded like he was saying they're not true. He was not doing that, but it ruined his career. He never recovered from the publication of this book, even though now I think we'd have to say that Strauss was onto some things that are now fairly straightforward in gospel criticism. Now, whatever we make of Strauss, either in the content of what he actually said about the Gospels and about Jesus, there's no doubt his work was of major significance on both fronts, both for the study of the Gospels and for the historical quest. And what's interesting is that he actually based his approach to the Gospels on the assumption of Matthean priority, the Gospel of Matthew as the first to be written. And it was interesting, around the same time in the 1830s, other people were challenging that view, which had been very common. The churches had always thought of Matthew first in the New Testament, and the most useful for teaching in churches, as the first gospel to be written. But for those that began to look at what had come to be called the synoptic problem, in other words, to examine the relationship between the first three gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, it was interesting that around the same time the whole assumption of Matthean priority was being challenged. So what Strauss had done was ask questions about the nature of the Gospels as texts, but he did it at the same time as other people were asking different questions about the literary relationship between the first three Gospels. And so in the late 1830s you had two scholars, Weiser and Wilke, who were starting to put together an argument for Markan priority, and indeed for what became the two-source hypothesis, according to which the Gospel of Mark, and then a collection of sayings, which came to be known as Q, alongside Mark, were seen as the sources behind Luke and behind Matthew. And this was then really enforced and consolidated in 1863 when Heinrich Julius Holtzmann produced a book on the origins of the Gospels, which really made the two-source hypothesis the norm for the study of the Gospels in the later part of the century and beyond. And interestingly, I think it could be said that this development of the two-source hypothesis could be seen as a way in which more orthodox biblical scholars and theologians were finding a way to counter Strauss. So the assumption was there within the two-source hypothesis that if you got to the earliest layer of resource material, and therefore as far back as you could go in getting to the historical Jesus and to the sayings which might be authentic, then you would have historically reliable material. Of course, that doesn't necessarily follow, but it would be another 50 years before the real consequences of that would come home to roost. In the same year as Heinrich Julius Holtzmann published his book on the origins of the Gospels, 1863, the only Roman Catholic contributor to this survey of the Old Quests that I'm going to mention, Ernest Renan, was publishing his Life of Jesus. Renan was initially going to train, and did begin to train for the priesthood, but lost his faith in his 20s. And he was one of the many people in the 19th century who wanted, like the many Protestants were mentioning, who wanted to subject the origins of Christianity to rigorous historical scrutiny. He spent a lot of time in the Middle East himself, so his history, as well as being informed by the latest in critical thinking of how you do history, was also informed by geographical and archaeological knowledge of the place he was writing about. And Renan's book is regarded as one of the most influential books on Jesus, even though it may not, with hindsight, be regarded as one of the most accurate. It was nevertheless beautifully written and was sold in tens of thousands of copies in its original French and then in many, many other translations. And what Renan tries to do is, as well as having a historical approach to the Gospels and to Jesus, he accepts that the historian has to use his or her imagination when writing the accounts of what you're looking at. So, as well as being deeply informed, you also have to write in an entertaining way. So that's partly why he produced a work that many people wanted to read. But the Jesus he presents is very much a political figure, locked in the intricacies of the politics and economics of first century Palestine, and a bit of an idealist figure, the kind of figure that a 19th century idealist might want to find, like many of the writers about Jesus that we're actually looking at. Alongside the detailed work that was being undertaken on the Gospels around this time, and together with the different approaches to Jesus that were being adopted by believers and unbelievers alike, you've also, of course,